Hello, everyone, and welcome to lesson 1.4, which is entitled Rewriting History. So, this is going to be a continuation of our historiography that we were talking about in the previous lesson. So, we're going to talk about how historians look at the past historical events and how those events are looked at through different lenses, through different periods of time. So, by the end of this lesson, you will be able to explain and understand three different schools of thought regarding history, which will be the Orthodox viewpoint, the revisionist viewpoint, and then the post revisionist viewpoint of history. So, looking at different versions of history, this is all going to center around the context of the Cold War. So you'll need to understand the ideas of the Cold War that happened between 1945 and 1991 between the United States and the Soviet Union and all of the historical events that have spanned that time period. So we're talking about things from Berlin airlift and the division of Germany into two different countries, the Korean conflict, the Vietnam War, um, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and the crushing, of uh, Hungarian rebels in the 1950s. I mean, all the different things that you can think of between 1945 and 1991, all of this is going to center around the ideas of the Cold War. So, there are three different schools of historiography and historical thought. And of course, you can look at this with any historical event. So, while the Cold War started at any historical series of events, the Orthodox view is always the traditional perspective. So, whatever we learned about it originally, that is the Orthodox viewpoint. Revisionist viewpoint reinterprets the historical account. And what this means is the revision of the historical record can reflect new discoveries of fact and evidence and interpretation, which then results in revised history. This is usually about 10 to maybe 20 years. Okay, so 10 to maybe 20 years. Post revisionists challenge the revisionists by accepting some of their findings but rejecting some of their key claims. Challenges the Orthodox historians by conceding to the revisionists, and this is seen as synthesis. What this means is the combination of ideas to form a theory or system. So people who are post-revisionist, they look at both the Orthodox and the revisionist systems, and they can look at key findings and they can say, well, we agree with some parts of the revisionists, and they completely upset the Orthodox, they completely upset the Orthodox because they do accept some of the revisionists, but they don't accept all of the revisionists. So post revisionists are accused, or not accused, but are actually helping advance synthesis for historical analysis and historical discussion. So, what exactly does a orthodox account of history look like? So, the first school of interpretation to emerge in the United States was the school of thought which was orthodox. So, for more than a decade after the end of World War II, so we're talking about from 1945 to, say, 1955, few American historians challenged the official American interpretation of the beginnings of the Cold War. This was that the Soviet Union was responsible. They were the most aggressive. They had, you know, uh, conned the people of Eastern Europe, and they were conning the people of, or they were trying to expand into places like Turkey and into the Middle East because of oil. They were expanding into Asia because of China. So the USSR was completely responsible for it. And this was the typical American patriotic perspective for American historians. So this is what, for example, my mother would have been taught in school, and maybe your grandparents would have been taught in school. So this particular account of all of human history lasted until around, maybe the late 50s into the 1960s. So the U.S. involvement in Vietnam disillusioned some historians and created a minority of sympathy towards like the Viet Cong and other communist groups. This is revisionist history comes from. This is where it starts to come from because many people throughout the 60s became very disillusioned with what the United States was doing in Southeast Asia and Vietnam. And as a result, many historians started going back and questioning what was happening in the past and saying, okay, well, did some of the things that we were taught as children, did that lead to some of those logical fallacies? Does that look familiar? So logical fallacies that we talked about in previous lessons. And so revisionist historians are looking at, or are going through a more keener and finer tooth comb with all of global events. And so more important to revisionists argue that the U.S. and the Soviet Union were responsible for the Civil War, the Cold War, and so they're both almost equal. It counters the standard patriotic American narrative where we were, always the savior. And American historians calling American practices into question. So this is, again, goes back to that idea of questioning the government. And critical of American government saw Americans as more culpable in some ways. So revisionist historians basically calls the Americans to take a step back and reflect on our role, that we maybe what did we say or do that may have contributed to the Cold War and advancing the Soviet response the way they did. And lastly, in our post-revisionist accounts of history, they challenged revisionists by accepting some of their findings but rejecting many of their key claims. So the claims are who they or what they think was responsible for the event. So they do accept some of their findings, that these events were not just based upon the Orthodox viewpoint, that these are just America was some kind of a savior. They don't accept that. So they do accept some of the revisionist findings, but their key claims on who or what may be responsible is where post-revisionists differ. So another current attempt to strike balance between Orthodox and revisionist camps, identifying areas of responsibility for the origins of the conflict on both sides. So this is where this is coming from, the whole idea of post-revisionist with the idea of responsibility. So let's take a look at this graphic here. With the revisionists, they look at history from different revised perspectives, and the U.S. must share some aspect of the blame. So again, revisionists are still focusing on who is to blame. Is it the USSR or is it the United States? So who is to blame? Who has more blame here? Post-revisionists, what they're looking at is that, yes, they accept some of the findings that they may have about, why the United States did the Cuban Missile Crisis and that we did have these responsibilities and we did this wrong and that wrong. But post-revisionists, this is what the difference is. Not who is responsible, but what was to blame. Was there a breakdown in diplomacy? Were there economic factors? Because the United States and the Soviet Union do not just make decisions based upon people. There are other things that are at play here. Is there a breakdown in diplomacy? Is there economic factors? Is there a global pandemic going on? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What is going on that could potentially be the backstory to this, causing these nations to act and respond the way they are? That is how post-revisionist historians take a look at history. So that concludes our lesson 1.4, rewriting history. So can you explain and do you understand the three different schools of thought regarding history, such as the Orthodox viewpoint, the revisionist viewpoint, and the post-revisionist viewpoint? If you do, pat yourself on the back. You did an amazing job. Thank you so much for your attention in this lesson. So take a look to see if there's any activities for lesson 1.4. If there is, complete them and then move on to lesson 1.5. Thanks so much for your attention today and have a great day.